Hello, Rebels. Welcome to the base. Steve Hilton here. Kristen Garcia-Jamont is with me today. Kristen, how are you doing?
Great.
So we've got a very special guest today, someone who's taken a brave step after the recall. Everyone said Republicans can't win a statewide election. Here's someone today who's trying to prove that wrong. I'm very excited to talk to him about his plans, also about what's going on right now with California politics. Before we get to that, make sure you follow us at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to have more of you join us. It's great to have you with us. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell everyone. We need more rebels in the base. Let's introduce our guest today, Lanhee Chen. He's at the Hoover Institution. He's a friend of mine. You've seen him on my Fox News show. You've seen him all over the media. He's a very, very experienced commentator on political events, been involved in policy formation for many years, very, very smart. And relevantly to our conversation, he is running for state controller here in California. Lanhee, how are you doing?
Steve, great to be with you. Thank you for having me on.
I'm excited to hear all about your race, and not least what the state controller does. I think that is a big question that a lot of people have. But first, let's just get your reaction to the election, the statewide election we've just had, the recall election. Your thoughts on how that went down, the campaign and the result, and what it means for those of us here in California who are looking for change.
Yeah, I mean, look, Steve, continue to believe that the reason we had a recall in the first place, a lot of those reasons are still around. You know, life in California is good, but it could be a lot better. And the challenges that we face, whether it's the homelessness crisis, public safety issues in too many of our communities, a cost of living that is exorbitant for many families, these issues that drove the recall are still issues that we face in California. And so it would be a mistake to think, well, the recall did not succeed. These issues have gone away. I think nothing further from the truth is the reality. And if you look at these issues, if you look at how the recall was doing during the months of July and August, when a majority of Californians were interested in recalling Gavin Newsom, they were interested in recalling him because they were focused on his record. The minute that Governor Newsom could deflect and talk about something else, the attention shifted from his record, and unfortunately, the recall at that point was not going to be successful. But I continue to believe that the issues that you talk about on this show, the issues that Californians are well familiar with, those issues remain, and it's incumbent upon those of us who want change to make the case for why we need that change. And that's why what you're doing is so valuable. That's why those of us who are thinking about how we can change the status quo, I think the work we're doing is important, and I think the work goes on.
Well, I love hearing that you're hopeful, Lanhee, but I'm a little depressed about the recall result because didn't voters say, yeah, we care about the issues, but really not enough to implement any change, and certainly not enough to elect a Republican?
Well, you know, Kristen, I think that there's a couple issues. First of all, in political campaigns, and I've been through a number of them, when you get outspent 6, 7, 8 to 1.
Yeah,
it's very difficult to convey the message you want to convey. And in this situation, by the way, the anti-recall forces did have resources that allowed them to have a message that was much more broadly available than people who were in favor of the recall. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, the minute that Gavin Newsom was able to deflect this campaign away from his record and talk about really national politics or issues in the past, I think that's when this became a lot more challenging. And it is incumbent upon people who want to make the case for change, people who want, for example, voters to look at an alternative, to present that alternative clearly and to say, listen, here is exactly the kind of change we're talking about. Here's how we're going to make your lives better. And I think, unfortunately, some of that was lost in the mix. We had so many people running to replace Gavin Newsom. I think some of that message got lost. And the last thing I would say is, Californians are still, I think, cognizant of the fact that one-party governance, and the Democrats have been in charge now. Look, since 2006, we haven't had a Republican elected statewide. There really aren't any more excuses that they can make for some of the challenges that we face in the state. It really is about being a lot clearer in terms of talking about what those challenges are. I think down the stretch in that recall election, there was so much about everything else and not nearly enough about, look, here are the challenges that we face. Here are the things that Newsom has done that are bad. why aren't we focusing on these things specifically? So I think, unfortunately, the combination of all those factors just led to an outcome that was disappointing. There's no question about it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like in politics, sometimes, you're in, and I've been involved in many elections in many places over the years, and sometimes you just look at the other side and you think, yeah, you know what, this is going to be a tough one, right? The record is pretty good. How do we fight against this? Obviously, we think that we can do better, but you know what, this is not a bad record that they're running on. That is certainly not true here in California. Let's just talk quickly before we get to your race. I'm just really interested. A lot of people are, looking at what's happened since the recall, just specifically what's been going on. And we talked to Jeremy White from Politico about it the other day, and he was saying, well, actually, this is the time of year when you typically get a lot of bill signings from the governor. The legislature pushes things through and he signs the bill. So, but it just feels like since the election, there's just this one thing after another, as if they've been emboldened by it. And of course, the big one was the vaccine mandate for schools. And I was just wondering what your reaction, I mean, how do you feel about that, particularly the vaccine mandate for schools, but also some of these bills that we've seen pushed through since the recall?
Yeah, I think it's classic in some ways, Steve, that you see now a politician and the Democratic Party have been emboldened by the outcome of the recall. They feel like they have carte blanche now to do whatever they want to do, even if some of those things are dissonant with what the majority of Californians want. And whether it's the imposition of more state government control, or in some cases expanding things that they've done before, spending ever more money on programs that have questionable efficacy. All of these things, I think, are a function of a belief that they can do essentially whatever they want now because they have the mandate to do it. On COVID-19 restrictions, we didn't even talk about those. I mean, that's really some of what drove people's dissatisfaction with Gavin Newsom, what they perceived to be his abuse of emergency powers to impose restrictions on individuals, restrictions on businesses. And that same mindset, unfortunately, is driving a lot of this. Steve, some of this has even become very overtly political. We have heard about the governor and Democrats in Sacramento actively trying to use COVID-19 as a political issue to try and drive wedges in the population. It's a very cynical approach. And I don't think it's going to work. I think Californians are going to see right through that because, at the end of the day, what California, the great thing about California, I grew up in California, in Southern California. I've been in California many years of my life. I think what makes California great is this sense of a can-do spirit. And when government steps in and says, you can't do something, I think people naturally repel and revolt against that. And I think that's part of the challenge that Newsom and Democrats are going to face is that they think they've got a political winner. But the reality is people in California, I think, know and think very differently.
Do you think parents are against the mandate? Because my personal experience is actually they're in favor of it, which is shocking. But I might live in a very,
yeah, well, look
deepest
where we
of
live,
blue
Kristen.
enclaves. I know it might be where we live, but as you're going out talking to voters,
we're all in the Bay Area. I mean, crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy.
But when you're
town.
talking to voters, are parents for this? Because it's ripping a right away from a parent. Is that how they perceive it, or they think it's COVID protection?
I think it depends on what part of the state you're in. I think you're absolutely right that in some parts of the state, people are very much in favor of it. But I will tell you, whether they're in favor or against it, I think fundamentally parents want to be able to make decisions for their kids. And they want to make decisions that are in the best interest of their kids and their families. In some cases, that will be, to proceed forward with very aggressive measures. In other cases, it may not be. But fundamentally, what I'm intrigued by is just given where we are in this conversation, right? We don't even have an approved vaccine yet for children under the age of 12. And we're having this conversation now about all of this stuff. It seems to me a little bit premature in the sense that let's see how this develops and then figure out what we need to do to ensure that we're keeping people safe. I, and I'm sure all of us, are in the same boat. We want to keep people safe. We want, obviously, to conduct business and for schools to go on safely, but we also need to recognize that there are things about this virus and this pandemic and this situation that are still evolving. And so it's quite premature of us, I think, to be drawing certain conclusions about what is and isn't necessary. So I think it really depends on the part of the state you're in, but I don't think any parent would disagree with the notion that they want to be able to do what is in the best interest of their child and have the ability and the freedom to do so.
Yeah, but they don't, because, that exactly, and so you're being forced to. And that's the terror, that's what's so, I think, deeply offensive about this whole thing is that you're saying to parents, either you get your kid vaccinated when, the overwhelming, all the science, all the data, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, notably at Stanford, put very clearly, his sense of the data, which is that the risks from the vaccine, however small they may be, the risk from to children, the risk from the vaccine are greater than the risks from the virus. And so you're telling parents to vaccinate their children or them not be educated. Because a lot of these schools, they're not even offering the online anymore. I mean, the whole thing is just, it's so authoritarian.
It is. And parents are forgetting that your children sat next to unvaccinated people every year. So there was an opt-out, there always has been, for the traditional vaccines. It used to be there was a personal belief exemption. I'm sure we all remember just getting a little piece of paper. All you did was check the box. So I thought that was crazy. Like, you can just say you don't want to get the smallpox vaccine, the measles vaccine. This is outrageous. But you didn't know which child checked the box, and they still were able to go to school. So Steve's absolutely right. To now add on top of it that essentially you can't go to school. That's new. Right. So it's not just the mandate that's new. It's the fact that they're saying, and you cannot go to school is new. So I'm not sure what's going on. But it's heartening to hear, Lanhee, that at least you're hearing from parents that are trying to fight back and say it's not right.
What? Let's just turn to the future then, Lanhee. I want to hear about this this role, because I've seen it, right? I've seen elections and election materials, and you see this controller. But honestly, I'm pretty involved in politics, as you know. I don't really know what the state controller actually does. Yeah. So let's start with that.
Thank you, because I don't either.
If you win this race, as we hope you do, what will you be doing? What's the state control? What's the job involved?
Yeah, well, Steve, you are, both you, Steve, Kristen, both of you guys, I know, follow politics very closely. And it's not surprising for me to hear that you haven't had a lot of interaction with the state controller's office. That's probably a good thing. That you haven't had more interaction. To step back for a moment, there are 8 officials who are elected statewide every 4 years in California. Uh-huh. And those 8 officials all have their own jobs and their own independent mandates, as it were. You have the governor and lieutenant governor and the attorney general, who people generally have some sense of, who they are and what they do. The state controller is one of those 8. And the simple way to think about it is,
I'm really interested. What are the others?
The chief...
Sorry to interrupt you, Alan. Just before we get to your one, just remind us what the other ones. I've never heard it put like that before. The 8. So you've got the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general.
You've got controller, you've got a treasurer, and we'll talk about the difference between controller and treasurer. Mm-hmm. You have a secretary of state, you have an insurance commissioner, and then you have the state superintendent of public instruction. Those are the 8 who are elected statewide. And by the way, I mean, this may be the first time that some people are even hearing that they elect some of these 8 people statewide, but the entire state of California elects these folks, and they're all independent from one another. So the lieutenant governor does not report to the governor. The controller does not report to the governor. Everybody has their own independent power base, as it were, their own independent constituency, which I think is a very powerful statement in some ways. Constitutionally, the design here was to create politicians and public servants who would be independent. But over time, that's gone away, right? Because you've got all of these 8 elected officials end up being from the same party, and fundamentally, what's their number one concern? Their number one concern isn't serving the people, it's serving each other. It's serving each other's political interests. It is what I call a one-party monopoly, because that's what it's been. You essentially have all these guys and gals looking after each other as opposed to looking after voters. Okay, so the controller is the chief financial officer of the state of California. The person who is responsible for every dollar the state spends. Okay, so we have a controller who looks after the money going out. The treasurer looks after the money coming in. That's kind of the way to think about it. Oh, that's
interesting. So one is the treasurer is revenue, and controller is spending.
That's a very basic way to look at it, and I think fundamentally that's the distinction. So the controller has a couple different things that he or she, the incumbent, is a woman. The few things that the controller is responsible for. The controller is responsible first and foremost for accountability of where our state is spending its money. Interestingly enough, in 2018, the state of California issued about $300 billion in checks, billion with a B. The controller, actually, the current controller, is either unable or unwilling to tell the people of this state where that $300 billion went. There is no transparency around every single check that this state cut. I mean, if you think about this, Steve and Kristen, in your own lives, in your own budgets, your family budget, people who are listening who own a small business, you're keeping very close track of where that money is going. You know, hey, I wrote a check for $50 to the YMCA for membership dues, or I wrote a check to somebody to pay for soccer lessons for my kid, whatever it might be. You know where those checks went. And if you run a business, you have to know where those go, because if you don't, you may end up in jail. In the state of California, it's business as usual for us to keep spending money and have no accountability.
So can I just stop you there on checks?
When
you say checks, just to be, are you talking about like the checks to individual, like welfare payment check, or just general expenditure? Some may be to contractors, suppliers of services, whatever.
Even
anything.
Even the EDD checks. How about EDD checks?
Yeah, exactly.
Anything. I mean, EDDs. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's a perfect example of where we don't have accountability around how that money is being spent. We don't know the line item by. I'm talking about individual line item by line item.
That's amazing.
They can't tell you.
Are you serious?
Where that money went.
I remember back in the day, we introduced this in the UK government, based on. I mean, there's at the federal level with the federal government, you have spending.gov, where you can look up the spending, and it's all online. The individual transactions, and you can follow a lot of things. I mean, for example, that's one of the really useful resources that we use to try and track the. I mean, completely sort of different topic, but with my for my Fox News show, getting into the investigation of the origins of the pandemic and the grant program for the National Institutes of Health, and tracking that money that went from Dr. Fauci's NIAID through EcoHealth Alliance to the Wuhan lab and all that. That's all very transparently reported at the federal level. Are you saying there's not an equivalent at the California level, that I can't go and look up what the state of California spends? Item by item. It's amazing if that's really the case.
Yeah, and in fact, it gets even worse, Steve, because the state
amazing.
For many years now has promised that there would be this fiscal transparency, financial transparency portal, and it should not be shocking to you or to any of your listeners that the project is behind and well over budget.
But this is insane. I mean, this was done like years. Yeah, I'm sorry to be so, but like I know, because I was involved in literally implementing this in the UK government, based on what had already been done by the US. There was a bill in Congress requiring this, I believe. I can't remember who did it. It was a model for what we did. Every item over a certain amount, is it $300 or something? Like at the federal level.
Right, exactly.
But I mean, maybe I've got that wrong, but I'm so stunned. I know that other states have done it, because I looked at other states, when we were putting this together in the UK, other states and this was over a decade ago that this was being, and in California, the home of this is amazing. I honestly didn't know this.
It's, they blame everything, right? They say, we don't have the technology to do it. We don't have the manpower to implement it. And it's all excuse after excuse. Pretty much every other state, even Illinois.
Yes, that's right. I've seen it.
Notoriously corrupt state of Illinois. Even they can do it. And it's like, the only reason I think we don't do it in California is because they just don't want it to happen. I really have concluded that's probably what it is, because it's definitely not the technology. I've talked to lots of innovators.
Of course it's not. It's absolutely absurd. I mean, you can do it, of course. And so to anyone listening, why are you getting bogged down in the process, and who cares if there's a website where you can look up spending? The reason it's so important is because if you don't have the transparency, that's the hiding place for the corruption, for waste, for completely kind of bogus programs and pointless programs. It's this sort of foundation for everything else you want to do to reform spending. And of course, the
That's right.
connection is, sorry, I'm now sort of probably making your case for you, but the reason the spending is so important is because that's what drives the high taxes. We complain all the time about the high taxes, personal taxes, business taxes, California being a state where you don't want to do business, tax rates, you're driving business out of the state. Well, it's the spending that drives that. And so if you have no control of the spending, and if you don't know what the spending is because it's not reported, then how are you ever going to reduce the spending in order to eventually reduce the taxes? So I'm so glad you started with that. I'm stunned by this, Lanhee. Absolutely stunned.
You're exactly right, Steve, that's why I think this office is so important. People say, well, why are you running for controller? Nobody knows about it. But I think the root of our problems, a lot of our problems in California, is the inability for us to understand where all of this money we're sending to Sacramento is going. How's it being spent? Is it actually solving problems? And I'll just say briefly, a couple of the other responsibilities of the office. So the biggest thing is let's have some accountability about the money going out. Mm-hmm. The second thing the controller is responsible for is auditing. The controller is the chief audit officer as well. And you can actually go in as controller and you can audit any agency of state government, any program at the state level, or any local agency that uses state tax dollars. It's a tremendously powerful platform because you can now go in and say, we're spending tens of billions of dollars on the homelessness problem. Where are we spending it? What kind of a return are we getting on our investment? I can actually go in as controller and say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give every single program a letter grade. We're going to say you're spending $1 billion a year on this program to build tents in San Francisco. How has that been going? That is a D- program, let's say, for example. And then you turn around and you ask the public, why are you supporting legislators and executives that are paying this much money for a D- program? Does that make sense to you? I mean, this is really about sunlight being the best disinfectant. And so the audit power is also very important. The last thing I'll just say is the controller sits on almost 80 different boards and commissions across the state of California, including the boards that oversee the big state pension funds, the public employees pension fund, the teachers pension fund. And I think one of the things we need to do there, talk about transparency, is bring transparency into that process to say exactly how much money are we as taxpayers on the hook for. When we talk about all these pension obligations in the long run, we don't have any sense of what our real obligations are. Let's bring transparency to those as well. So the more you dig into it, Steve and Kristen, the more you realize this office can actually do a lot of great things when it comes to a lot of different issue areas.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about the pensions because that's like become a third rail where it's so huge and people need to pay attention. But going back to the EDD for a second, because like it's such a scandal. It's so unbelievable to me. And I had sort of put it in the EDD is super incompetent and we all knew that and kind of have been called out. But are you saying that the controller sort of oversees that and would have been another check and balance to say, wait a minute, why are we sending 20 billion, out of the country? This is because you'd think a controller would do the basic check of like, this doesn't even seem like a California resident. Is that the controller would have oversight over this?
It's even more than you think, because 10 years ago, we had a report come out about the EDD during and right after the Great Recession that said if the EDD doesn't get its act together, there will be a massive fraud. There will be a massive scandal. And nobody did anything about that. The controller at the time didn't take that report and say, you guys need to fix this. And then when this time rolled around, when we had the pandemic and the economy shut down and lots of people needed to get on unemployment insurance, what happened is the governor actively made a decision to say, we're going to open the floodgates. We're going to let anybody who applies get the benefits. We don't care who they are. We're not going to cross-check it. And the controller did not step in at that time and say, hey, wait a second. Is that the right thing to be doing? Should we not have some kind of way? Can we not implement some kind of technological algorithm that can at least say, hey, why are you sending 25 checks to San Quentin State Prison? Why are you sending a check to Dianne Feinstein, the U.S. Senator? Why are you sending a check to Scott Peterson, who's a convicted murderer? I mean, this stuff is not rocket science, Kristen. And yet the state over and over again, I get so worked up about this because this was the most preventable fraud in American history. And I want listeners to understand this. $30 billion in fraud. Okay? $30 billion. Our entire state general fund is $120 billion. You're talking about almost 25% of how much the state general fund is that was fraudulently given away to people. I mean, this is a massive fraud.
Exactly. That's 30 billion fraud. 120 billion is the general fund. So that's what does that actually mean? That means the amount that's spent on, I don't know, programs that people, does it include the education money? Does it include
so a lot of education is separate from that. And then there's a lot of federal money we get that's separate from that. But I mean, you talk about healthcare, you talk about corrections, infrastructure. A lot of that money comes out of the general fund. So this is not, it's not like someone ripped
context for that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But you're right to get upset because you don't even need an algorithm, Lanhee. This is a database check.
Yeah.
They could have literally just said these are approved zip codes, and any international zip code needs a second set of eyes.
I'm telling you.
And they confused the public by saying it was a complicated fraud. And so I'm glad to hear you getting this agitated about it, because somebody needs to say this wouldn't have happened under my watch. And this was this was a second grader could have pulled this off.
I want to put a fine point on this because now federal prosecutors are starting to go after some of these fraudsters. I want people to understand what they used your tax money. These people who committed fraud, they used your tax money to buy a new house. They used your tax money to buy a new Audi. They used your tax dollars for all sorts of nefarious stuff. And how's that working out for those of you who are working hard and paying your taxes and doing what you need to do to play by the rules? This should be angering to every Californian. And the fact that we don't have people in Sacramento more worked up about it, to me, is mind-boggling. This is a disaster that nobody wants to fix.
So I think that's a very, very, the EDD is just going to, because they actually did break through. People were aware of the fact that this was going on, not perhaps in as much detail as you've laid out, and I'm sure you will in your campaign, but I think that's a really strong one for you. Can I ask about the other aspects, like the auditing of programs? So you said that you could dive in. Let's just say, I don't know, the city of San Francisco, whatever, they get some state money to do their homelessness program. So anything where there's any state money, you can go and audit the whole program. Is that what you said?
You can audit the program, you can audit the spending, and that includes, by the way, local school districts too. Local school districts who've gotten money during the pandemic.
I mean, it's mostly state money, isn't it? I mean, most of the state, what is it? I can't remember. This is the money. What's the title? It's called. It's good. What's the name of the school money?
You mean where 50% of the revenues has to get allotted to the schools? Yeah,
there's some sort of description. The stream of money that comes from the state to local school districts.
Yeah.
But what and how much are you allowed to kind of get into the the actual kind of design and implementation of those programs? For example, would you be allowed to get very specific and say, look, we need you in order to, can you change the like you say, well, if you want this money to continue, you need to hit these metrics, or we need to see some metrics about what's actually being done, or how much can you? Yes, exactly. How much can you get into that level of, I suppose, changing things rather than just highlighting them?
Yeah, well, the controller is empowered to make recommendations to bring a lot of this stuff to light publicly, which is important. At the most extreme, the controller can say, I'm not going to cut this check. I don't believe that. Now, you have to use that power sparingly, obviously. You can't just willy-nilly not pay things. But you can
quite like the idea of willy-nilly not paying things. I think that sounds fine. I think you should do that.
Well, then you end up in court all the time, which is probably fine too, right? Because then it shows you're actually doing something. Yeah. But the point is, you can actually there's actually an example of the controller doing this when Alex Padilla, who is now the U.S. Senator, used to be Secretary of State. He cut a sweetheart deal to take money that was coming into the state and give it to a Democratic PR firm instead of giving it to local county registrars of voters. This was money that was coming in from the feds to help more people vote and to get access to the vote.
Is this the one that went to the Anita Knickerbocker, the Anita Dunn?
Yes.
SKD Knickerbocker. Yeah.
Right.
So the controller, who was a Democrat, this is how bad it was. The controller, who was a Democrat, actually said, yeah, we're not going to pay that contract because that doesn't seem like it was right. So you know what they did? The Democrats in the legislature went back and passed a bill to retroactively make the contract okay
Amazing.
So the controller had to pay it.
That's amazing.
I mean,
I didn't know that.
This is the amazing stuff that goes on with the one-party monopoly.
So can I ask about that? Go on, Kristen,
go ahead.
sorry.
I was just going to say, so then I want to ask about that. Like, why does it matter sort of what party you are? Like, do we care that you're a Republican or a Democrat?
It shouldn't.
Don't we just want an ethical person who's good at math?
And you know, one of the things I would say is, listen, you know what? We need a check, right? It doesn't. I don't. It's not like I come at this position and say I have a Republican way to be the controller. No, I have a way to make sure that we're independent and accountable. By the way, if it's Republicans who are up to no good, I'm just as happy to audit them too, right? I mean, this is not about partisanship. This is about, can we have someone who's willing to be a check on everything else that's going on and who doesn't owe their political career to somebody else? That's the problem with all these Democrats running around in Sacramento. They all owe each other. Well,
this is the last thing I wanted to. I know you got to go, and I found this conversation absolutely fascinating, and I hope we can talk about it, many more times between now and the election. And I want to end with, I want you to tell us how people can get involved in supporting you. But last question to you, which is this point about the political connection. So the person who's currently in the job, are they? I mean, as the point you made at the beginning about how these positions are actually constitutionally independent. I mean, who is the controller? And do they just like see themselves as kind of signing off whatever Gavin Newsom wants? What's that sort of power politics right now? And how would you see? I mean, if you were elected, what would you be? I mean, you would presumably be completely. I mean, you say you'd be independent, but actually you'd be antagonistic because, chances are, I mean, we don't know, it's a long way away, but based on the recall, you're going to have a Democratic and probably Newsom again. So it'll be like this, like the French, they call it cohabitation. You have different parties there. Talk about that a little bit just to close us out.
So the current controller is a woman named Betty Yee. She's actually leaving office next year. So she is done with her 8 years as controller. People probably didn't even notice, right, the last 8 years because she barely ever really pushed back on, with the exception of the case we talked about, really ever pushed back on anybody else. And so you're right. I think in some ways you should want a controller who's going to be antagonistic to everybody else because you should want somebody keeping an eye on your money. You should want somebody asking tough questions and saying, are you sure that's right? Are we really getting the most bang for our buck? Are we really solving this problem? Hey, if we're solving the problem, spend the money. I'm okay with that. But if you're not, somebody's got to be willing to call it out. And unfortunately, Steve, I'll just say this. Too many people who seek this office seek it because they see it as, hey, I'm just going to do this for a few years on my way to running for governor, on my way to doing something else. I'm just another one of these politicians. I got nowhere else to go. I've been on like the Board of Equalization, or I've been a supervisor of a county or something else, and I need another job. Hey, I'm going to go be controller. It's ridiculous. All right, let's have somebody who's actually qualified, who has a background in understanding fiscal issues and understanding how budgets and how businesses work. And let's bring that experience to Sacramento to actually get something done for the people of the state. I hope that your listeners agree. That's what we need. You mentioned how people can get involved. I hope they go to my website. It's Chen for California, CHENFOR, California.com. Find out more about me, what I stand for, what we want to do. And if you're interested in coming along, sign up for updates, maybe chip in a couple bucks toward our campaign.
Yes.
But I really think we're going to do good stuff here, Steve and Kristen. I think we're going to make a difference if we're able to win this race.
I think it's fantastic. I've absolutely loved hearing about it and how important this role is. Totally eye-opening and brilliant. Just last point. I mean, it's the normal set of elections. So it's next November, right? That's when the election is.
We have a primary in June, which is a jungle primary here in California. All the parties run against each other, and the top two go on to the November election next year, yes.
All right. Well, let's talk about this a lot more. I think it's fantastic that you're doing this.
Thank you.
It's exactly what we want to support on this show. So really pleased that you could join us today, and we'll hope to see you very soon.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you,
Steve.
Okay, that was absolutely fascinating. Make sure that you continue following us, guys. Like and subscribe. You got to help us get the message out. Help us change California. We can do that together. So wherever you get your podcasts, listen up and subscribe. Thank you.